I'll see you guys in the dark.
I witnessed my son do something terrible on Halloween. I have a confession to make. I've been trying so hard to forget what I saw, but now that Halloween is right around the corner again, all these memories resurfaced all of a sudden. Now I know it was wrong to keep my mouth shut, but before I tell my husband about it, and later on the authorities, I want to get it off my chest anonymously. Maybe this will help me confessing to my loved ones. My son, I call him Al for the sake of this story, is crazy about Halloween. Each year he dresses up as a zombie. Al loves zombies. Last year he begged and pleaded with me to let him go trick-or-treating with his friends. I used to always come along, but that year he wanted to go out without adult supervision. Just him and his buddies. He was 10 years old at that time and pretty mature already. I was reluctant at first, but after thinking it over for a while, I approved. We live in a friendly rural neighborhood, bordering on large cornfields. Everyone knows everyone. I figured that they would be fine. The kid needed his freedom after all. Plus, his friend Amy would come along as well. She was 12 years old already and always reminded her younger friends to behave. However, one last glimpse of uncertainty within me caused me to decide that I would sneakily follow them to keep an eye on Al from a distance without bothering him, just to be absolutely safe. I did as planned on Hallows Eve. I let my son put on his costume and painted him with some spooky zombie makeup, complete with sprinkles of fake blood on his ripped clothing, and smears of it around his mouth. He took a look in the mirror and let out a squeal of delight. He hugged me, grabbed his little bag and rushed outside. I waited a bit before going outside myself. His father wasn't home that night, so I left a bowl of candy on the porch, in hopes that not being raided immediately. Upon walking out the door, I saw Al run towards a small group of other kids in fancy costumes. I recognized them all. There was Amy in a witch costume. Our neighbor's son, Mark, was a vampire, and there was a ghost who I could only assume was Al's best friend, Blake. I smiled at sweet sight. It was always the four of them. I followed them at a safe distance, trying not to catch their attention. I watched as they rang the doors of several houses on their harvest, growing more and more cheerful the more candy they received. It was obvious that Amy wasn't too fond of Al's costume though. From time to time, my son would scare her by jumping in front of her, all of a sudden or making creepy sounds. Amy would shriek loudly every single time, before bursting out in laughter. At some point along the way, they began developing all zombie scares into a full-on game of catch. My son merrily chasing around the others who, happily giggling, tried to avoid him. It was adorable to watch them play. I knew they weren't little anymore, but it still warmed my heart. They had reached the end of the main road, and were still playing catch. They were enjoying themselves, and I was content. Until Amy suddenly ran off into the cornfields, to the side of the road. Al, Mark, and Blake followed her, howling like little monsters along the way. I was taken aback. The cornfields were large, and children, or rather, residents of our neighborhood in general, were forbidden from entering it. Not because they were trampling down the corn, but because people had gotten lost in there before. I couldn't help but instantly get worried. I hurried to run after them, but seeing as I was in pretty bad shape, it took me a while to find them. When I finally caught up with them, I found that they had gathered at the side of the field. Amy was still chuckling, but completely out of breath. "Give me a second, you guys," she panted. "Oh, come on," Blake argued from under his white cloak. "Playing zombie is so much fun." All cheered. In the heat of the game, he was completely given up on his unusual calm demeanor and was losing himself in the fit of giggles. "Can we keep playing zombie, please?" "Yeah, just give me a second, guys," Amy repeated. She was still bent over and trying to catch her breath. Suddenly, the three boys struck their heads together and began murmuring something amongst themselves, out of earshot for Amy. What are you talking about?" the little girl asked. "We are playing zombie for real this time," my son exclaimed. I frowned in confusion, but stayed where I was. I watched as Blake and Mark strode towards Amy and grabbed her by the arms. "It's okay, they're just trying to scare her again," I told myself. But that notion was quickly knocked out of me when Al suddenly picked up a large stone from the dusty ground, his skinny arm struggling to lift the heavy thing. Slowly, in a pace almost menacing, he made his way over to Amy. I wanted to interfere. I wanted to dash out of my hiding spot and stop him, tear that rock put off his hands. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed. Tears began welling up in my eyes and running down my cheeks as my mouth dropped open, trying to form sounds, to somehow produce this shriek I was hoping for, but to avail. I tried to move. I tried so hard, but I just couldn't. My body didn't obey me. I watched in horror as my son lifted the rock above his head and brought it down on the screaming, struggling girl's head. He did it again, then again, and again. My son, my child, my flesh and blood bashed his friend's skull in. Blood was gushing everywhere, onto my son's hands, his face, and his costume. All let go of the stone and knelt down and fumbled around in the remains of Amy's head. I felt the vomit race inside my throat when I realized what he was doing. I remained paralyzed with fear, terror, and disgust as my son carefully picked up the bloodied, gory mess and slowly let bits of Amy's brain into his mouth. One by one they vanished in between his lips, like trick-or-treat candy. I didn't stay to watch Mark or Blake join him. When I finally regained control of my body, I simply turned and ran. I ran all the way back home, tears of shock still gushing out of my eyes. I barely made it into the bathroom before I started vomiting. When Al came home later that evening, I didn't come out to greet him. I wouldn't have dared to look in his eyes. I wouldn't have been able to. I haven't been able to look at him the same way ever since. I don't know why he did such a thing. Was it my fault? Where did I go wrong? How did my sweet little boy turn into a monster? I've pretended that everything was fine for almost a year now. Every time I would run into Mark or Blake's parents on the way around town, every time I would pick up my son from school, I pretended I never saw what I saw. They found Amy's corpse the day after Halloween. The police never found out who had done it. Otherwise, I wouldn't be writing this right now. No suspects were ever arrested either. When they questioned my son, he lied through his teeth. Amy's parents moved away not long after. They couldn't stand being in that home in which they had made so many memories with the daughter. I know I should have told the police, and I hate myself for being too weak to do the right thing. I was scared. Scared of my own son, but at the same time scared of losing him too. I hate myself for not helping Amy. I don't know why I was unable to move, but had I been able to, if I could trade my life for hers, she would be standing here right now. I wish Halloween 2018 had never happened. It has left my son a killer, a sweet young girl dead, and me, a guilt-striking shell of my former self. I'm not stupid. I know that withholding information from the police in a case of child murder has served legal consequences. I deserve everything that's coming to me, but so does he. I guess I thought telling the truth would make a difference. I wouldn't bring Amy back to life, but by now I know that those were just the cowardly, foolish thoughts of a cowardly and foolish woman. I know it's way too late, but for once I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to use the blood-stained costume as evidence. I never disposed of it. They're going to figure out which stains are Amy's and which are fake blood, alright? I'm going to name Mark and Blake too. No more Halloween. No more playing zombie.
Six American spies had infiltrated the British top-secret archives, but unfortunately, they were caught. Given permission by the law, British scientists were allowed to experiment on these prisoners using a new form of torture: starvation. The scientists placed 5 different colored flat spheres, barely the size of an American dime, on a small gray observation room table. The scientists first took the leader from the group of spies and gave him an option of red, orange, yellow, green, and purple colored spheres, telling him only one of the food pieces would not kill you. The American spy ate the yellow piece. After a short moment, he said he felt fine and wished to go back to his cell. The scientist disagreed and told him to wait a little longer. With no choice, the spy remained there in the small gray room, doing what he was told to do. Soon the spy told the scientist that he felt lightheaded, slightly dizzy, and nauseous. The scientist gave a menacing grin and wrote down what he said. The spy, holding his head, tried to stand up. "I can't think well." The scientist's grin grew larger as he continued to jot down what he was seeing. "Good." The spy fell to his knees and started to scream violently. "What did you do to me?" he pleaded. "You chose wrong. Simple as that." The scientist closed his notebook and left the spy in the room. "Wait. Where are you going?" The spy struggled to say as he held his head. "Please, let me see my team again. Please." He began to weakly claw at the door, but it was no use. It was made of reinforced steel and was locked from the outside. The spy's vision began to blur and get foggy. Soon he was not able to see or even speak a simple sentence. The unfortunate spy died from his brain dissolving within inside his skull. A thick black liquid soon began to seep out of his nose, mouth, eyes, and ears. The room was cleaned of the corpse and the liquid. He replaced the yellow piece of food and then let in the second spy. He told him the same thing he told the last one. Only one of the food pieces would let you live and save him from starvation, while the others would kill him. The spy hesitated, but his hunger took over. He chose the red piece. He felt fine at first, but after he took a deep breath, he held his heart in pain and fell to the floor. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. The scientist smiled with pleasure and jotted down what he observed of the spy. "Do you know what is happening?" The spy vigorously shook his head and tried getting up, failing as the pain became too great for his body to handle. The scientist laughed darkly and answered, "You are suffering from a heart attack. You chose wrong." He slammed his notebook shut and left the spy to suffer. After the scientist recorded his data, the room was cleaned again, and the third spy was sent in. He informed him of the same situation. If he chose correctly, he would live. If not, he would die. "Please, just let me go. I have a family," the spy pleaded. The scientist shook his head. "You were always the most difficult." He pressed a button to a remote and caused the collar around the spy's neck to shock him. "Now eat." The spy licked his dry lips and ate the green piece. After a few seconds of letting the food digest, he began to gag. He struggled to stand up, but only got to his knees. The burning liquid rocketed out of his system. Vomit pooled around him, and the thick liquid continually exited his system. The scientist chuckled and jotted down more notes in his notebook. "Sadly, you chose wrong as well." He stared down at the poor spy, still trying to hold back the repeating vomit. "Soon the acid will melt through your esophagus and your skin, making it near impossible for you to gain a single breath." He closed his notebook and sat there, watching the spy suffer. Acid tears melted scars into his face. Stomach acid melted through his throat and poured out. The spy held his stomach in desperate pain. His skin turned pale and sweaty as he collapsed and died. The mess was again cleaned up, the missing piece replaced, and another spy sent in. This one was young, looking like he just joined and was obviously a young adult, probably in his early 20s. He was timid, afraid of what was to come. "If you choose right from the 5 pieces of food that lay out in front of you, you will live. If not, you die, understand?" the scientist informed. The young American hesitantly nodded and took the orange-colored piece. After a minute of letting the food take effect, the spy's skin soon turned dry and red. He began to itch and shiver with a cold sweat. He soon gagged and choked on his own blood and held his side as he fell to the floor. "What's happening?" the young male rasped. The scientist quickly wrote down what he was observing with displeasure. "I was hoping for only your inner organs to fail, but it looks like the food also took effect on your skin. As we all know, the skin is the largest organ on the human body. I should have seen it coming." He pushed up his reading glasses and sat down. "Your organs are failing. You should die in a minute now." The young American looked up at the scientist in horror and tried standing. He grunted and tried breathing in air. His lungs had now failed him, and his heart would too. With the young American dead now, the scientist changed a few formulas in his chart, the corpse was removed, the food replaced, and the 5th spy sent in. He was husky, probably built more for combat than spying. The scientist was pleased and hoped for the spy to choose the last untasted food tablet on the table. "I will make this simple for you," the scientist announced from his observation spot. "All of your friends chose the wrong food tablet placed in front of you. They have chosen red, orange, yellow, and green. All of them had died a horrible death. But if you choose correctly, you will live." "For a scientist, you sure are an idiot," the spy informed him. "The only other one that you didn't call out was a purple one, so I'll eat that one." The scientist clicked his pen and waited for the spy to eat. highly interested in what would happen with the husky spy. The spy ate the purple food tablet with pride, happy to be picked near last, but soon regretted it. He spit onto the floor to see that his saliva was dark red, and his lower stomach felt like it was on fire as he propped himself up against the wall. Soon, he had blood all around him and onto the wall. The scientist smiled with glee and jotted down the effects. "This will be highly useful for hospital deaths in your country. You chose wrong." He left the spy to suffer and concluded how to counteract the food tablet's effects. The mess was cleaned, and the last spy was sent in. "Your friends," the scientist told him, "have all chosen wrong. If you eat any of the food tablets, you will die. But if you figure out how to counteract the food tablets, you will live and not die from starvation. Understood?" The scientist pointed to the spy with his pen. He merely nodded and observed the 5 food tablets set in front of him. Within an instant, he ate all of the food tablets at once and awaited for the scientist to speak once more. The scientist was baffled at first and closed his notebook without writing anything down. "You chose right. You may go back to your cell." The reinforced steel door opened and awaited for the spy to leave. But the spy shook his head and stood up. The scientist arched an eyebrow and observed closely with his notebook open and pen ready. The spy looked up at the observant scientist and spoke in a gruff voice. "I will not be controlled." With that, he hastily went to the closest wall and rammed his head as hard as he could into the concrete wall, smashing his head into it and leaving a giant concave area in his brain and skull. The scientist clicked his tongue and shook his head. "What a shame. I had other things to experiment on you." He left the observation room and went back to his studies. Years later, the British decided to let this new form of torture poison America. What you now know as Skittles today was used as a form of starvation torture in the 70s. So think about that the next time you eat a normal bag of Skittles, and make sure you eat the whole damn bag. Happy Halloween.
I live in a substantially normal neighborhood. I can't really say that the people here are shady. Most of them are just old. To give a little background of my town, most of the streets are parallel to each other, especially the section I live in. There's a lot of young people moving in because many of the old people in town are moving into a nursing home or, unfortunately, dying. I think it would be safe to say that I know most of the people who live in the area. Not personally, but I can recognize faces. Later last year, my friends and I decided to go trick-or-treating one final time. We were acting like angsty teenagers who thought it wasn't cool anymore. But we had already gotten costumes and wanted some candy. However, we thought it wasn't cool anymore. But looking back, I don't think trick-or-treating is safe anymore, truly. Anyway, I had to play a field hockey game after school, so I was itching to hang out with my friends. I finally headed home and got my costume on. At this point, it was getting dark, so my mom demanded I bring a flashlight with me. She's very protective and kind of strict. My dad, on the other hand, is the opposite. He's more willing to let me go places on my own and convinced my mom it would be okay if I went out trick-or-treating with a group of friends. My mom doesn't like there not being a parent around, but she knew we would stay within a couple of streets. Eventually she let up and allowed me to go. My friends began to show up at my house, but by the time we left, it was already pitch black. Once again, my mother warned me about strangers. I scoffed at her, trying to shake off the embarrassment of being lectured by my mom in front of my friends. I knew she was right, though. Maybe a group of high school girls could take down a predator. But I know that I couldn't by myself. I stayed as close as I could with my friends for most of the night, keeping an eye out on the weird figures or killer clowns, since there were rumors of some terrorizing an elementary school a few towns over. Everything seemed to be going well, and we were all having a good time, apart from trying to avoid our classmates out of sheer humility of trick-or-treating. All of my friends and I made some really good memories. Then it happened. It was around 8:45, and some of my friends were tired and wanted to be picked up. We gradually made it back to my house where they phoned their parents and left. I was a little upset about this. It just might have been my inner child, but I wanted more candy. I knew this was quite possibly my last year trick-or-treating ever. I wasn't ready to give it up just yet. My one friend, well, we'll call her Nancy, did not want to stop yet either. After all of my other friends left, we asked my parents if we could go out for another 30 minutes or so. My mom was reluctant. However, my dad did tell her that I was old enough, and most people wouldn't answer doors this late anyways, so we would be back pretty soon. It was around 9:10 at this point. Nancy and I went to the next street over in the opposite direction we went with the other group previously. I remember feeling uncomfortable for some reason, but brushing it off as I turned on my flashlight. It was pitch black, and the sidewalks are bumpy and cracked because the town is too lazy to fix them. I had a pretty bright flashlight that could shine a good 20 feet ahead of me. We made it to the next street and looked down. There were barely any porch lights on. I guess people figured the little kids were done and decided it was the end of the night. However, Nancy and I were not willing to give up and started at the first house on the left. No answer. Okay. We went across the street that had a bright porch light on. No answer from that house either. I still wasn't willing to stop, though. We tried a few more houses and got no answers. Nancy suggested we try 3 other houses, and if no one answered, then we would go back to my place. I agreed, sadly knowing that no one would give us candy this late into the night, and that this was the end. That's when I saw him out of the corner of my eye. It was a black figure walking down the road towards the house me and Nancy were standing at. He was wearing all black, with his face down and a hood on over his head. Something about him made my stomach lurch. I discreetly pointed him out to Nancy. She said she saw him a few houses before, just turning onto the street. This made me feel even more uneasy. Quickly, he began to approach us with his head down and his hands in his sweatshirt pocket. Looking back, who knows what he could have been hiding in there. The street was dead quiet except for me and Nancy, so he must have heard us. I instructed us to go to the house across the street, to make it seem like we were trick-or-treating and never even noticed the man. We went to the next house and knocked on the door. I was secretly praying someone would answer so the man would not get near, but no one did. I was really freaking out now. I turned around and he was walking in the street in front of the house right next to us. Then I realized he had crossed the street too. A wave of panic overtook me. I grabbed Nancy's arm and sprinted to the house he had just passed. Then he circled around and began following us in the same direction. I knew I had to do something. He began walking faster and faster towards us. Nancy and I sprinted for it. There's a good amount of space in between this street and mine, but I was on track and was willing to do anything to get away from this psychopath. He didn't run, but when I finally looked back, I saw him quickly walking the same way, still with his head down. From what I could tell, he seemed fairly young, maybe in his early 30s. I didn't recognize anyone like this from the area. Nancy and I were still running, though. Finally, we made it back to my street, and we hid near some bushes at the end. Then I realized we still had our flashlights on, and that's how he was so easily able to locate us. We shut them off, crouched near the bushes, and waited. I knew that if we tried to run to my house, he would see us. There wasn't enough time to make it there without him getting to the end of the street and seeing us. I was also terrified that he could find out where I lived. Never bring someone who's following you back to your house. Nancy and I finally saw him. He stood in the middle of the street and just peered down it. I could see his eyes, that's how close we were. They looked so blank and menacing. He knew we were somewhere, just not in the bushes only 10 feet away. After a few moments, he carried on walking. Nancy and I waited until he was on the next street, and then we booked it to my house. I told my parents, but my father only laughed, and my mother looked too tired to even care. My brother sat there and made fun of me for being paranoid. I'm never going to trick-or-treat ever again. Who knows what could have happened to me that night, or what that man was capable of. Later, there was a news story about children who had been abducted a few towns over. Instead, it could have been me and Nancy. So, creepy Halloween stalker, let's not meet again.
If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.